But it wasn't done. The counteroffensive went on, and it failed spectacularly. Again, it was evidence of Ukraine trying to use outdated tactics of a blitzkrieg in the age of modern warfare with drones, and they were destroyed before the first defense line. I don't think I need to go into detail, but it was a trap waiting to happen, and they walked right into it. But that offensive started in June, and by the second week of June, they had taken somewhere between 30 to 40% of all NATO equipment was lost in those first 2 weeks of the offensive. So it was a failed blitzkrieg. I mean, quite frankly, that offensive should never have been launched. There was a very interesting article by Professor John Mearsheimer, and he talks about the blitzkrieg. And he catalogues that there were about 11 blitzkriegs in military history, recent military history, since World War II. Most, if not all of them, were performed by the Germans in World War II. Out of those 11, the Germans were successful in 7. They lost 3, and I think one of them was considered like a draw, something like that. The 3 that they lost were against the Soviet Union, and there are certain characteristics that are necessary for the success of a blitzkrieg. One, and the most prominent one, is that the attacker must be stronger in size and munitions and manpower than the defender. All of the blitzkriegs that Germany won, they were the superior fighting force. When they butted against the Soviet Union, who was more or less even to them, that's where they lost. So first, the attacker must be stronger. Second, a blitzkrieg only works when there is one line of defense, such like the Maginot Line in France. Because a blitzkrieg is supposed to be a fast attack. A blitzkrieg is done to avoid getting into an attrition war. So you have your armored columns in an armored fist, they call it, and it's supposed to punch through that one defense line, and you have all these fast moving vehicles that will then spread out and cut off the supply lines and cause the whole defense to collapse. So, and the third component for a successful blitzkrieg is that it must be prefaced by an air campaign to bomb the defenses and try and clear a path for your armored column to move as quickly as possible. All 3 of those factors Ukraine did not have. Ukraine was the weaker and smaller army against Russia. Russia had built somewhere between 3 to 5 defense lines in Zaporizhia, where the main counteroffensive strikes occurred, and Ukraine had no air support. So, quite frankly, this was a suicide run. And as Scott Ritter said in an interview, whoever sanctioned the 2023 counteroffensive should be court-martialed for criminal negligence. And I agree. That was pure suicide. They did not have a chance in hell. And of course, we know they were destroyed beyond the first defense line through all sorts of traps and minefields and the drones. They were getting hit from drones, and the drones were picking up the positions and reporting back to the Russian artillery. I mean, it was a disaster. But after the second week, I don't know if many of you remember this, but I remember it clearly. Zelensky was saying that he wanted to call off the offensive to reassess. Either Zelensky or General Zaluzny said this, but I believe it was Zelensky. AKA, they wanted to stop it because it was a disaster, as I said. That was in around the second week of June. What happens in the third week of June? Prigozhin strikes again. The Prigozhin March. Within hours of the Prigozhin March beginning on June 23rd or 24th, Ukraine reinforced its counteroffensive, just like they reinforced their defensive backbone. And it went on for another 4 months. And of course, you know, the Prigozhin March ended in a day. What it resulted in? Well, it resulted in several things. And again, there's a whole video I did on this, a 27-minute detailed video on why I thought the Prigozhin March was a ruse. It's in the channel membership. I also made a sneak peek about it. I suggest everyone checks that out. But one of the main purposes of the Prigozhin ruse, which I did not see in that video, was that it achieved the same aim, in my opinion, that Prigozhin's antics achieved in Bakhmut. It misled the Ukrainians into a fake weakness in the Russian army, a fake rift that they thought they could exploit by doubling down on a military position that they should have retreated from. Bakhmut, and then the 2023 counteroffensive. And now they went on for 4 more months. They went nowhere. They only achieved capturing several small villages that are, I mean, I live in the Caribbean, and the size of those villages are like the size of some country villages in my country, 300 or 400 population. Some of them maybe have 1 or 2 streets in it. 4 months it took to capture that. And the Western media tried to sugarcoat and say, oh, it's going slower than expected, blah, blah, blah. It was probably the worst Blitzkrieg attempt in military history. I think you will struggle to find a record of a worse defeat than that. Further evidence that the idea of a blitzkrieg or a large-scale offensive is obsolete in this day of modern warfare. That's 2 areas of what I think deception used by the Russian army via Prigozhin to win battles. Now, of course, the result of that march is you have some 8,000 to 10,000 Wagnerians who were conducting the so-called march, battle-hardened troops who are now in Belarus. And what do you think they're doing in Belarus? Playing Scrabble with the Belarusian army? No. They are there training the Belarusian army in everything that they learned about modern warfare. Which brings me to another point. In late 2024, when Ukraine seemed to be wanting to escalate the war by striking into Russia with the permission of the Biden administration. I say Biden administration in inverted commas because I don't think it was Biden who sanctioned that. I think it was the actors behind him. I don't know if you know that speech Putin made where he says he has been through many US administrations and spoken to many US presidents. And they all have these great ideas about what they should do until the men in the black suits and briefcases come in, sit down, and tell them how things are done. And he was alluding to the deep state.
I have already talked with one US president, then another, and a third president. They come and go, but politics does not change. Do you know why? Because the power of bureaucracy is very strong. A person is elected, they come in with one set of ideas, and then people with briefcases come to them, well dressed in dark suits like mine, not with a red tie, but with a black or dark blue one. And they start explaining how things should be done.
There's a very interesting video clip of the US Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. If I find it, I will put it in this video when I'm editing it. And Mike Johnson was talking about how many times he went to speak with Biden, and he would ask Biden, why did you do this, or why did you take this action? And Biden would be totally unaware of what he was talking about. And you're saying, I know some of you think that it's because he has his dementia, but he, speaking with Biden in the moment, genuinely believed that President Biden had no idea why a certain action was taking place. And I mean, I'm missing out parts of this video, but of the clip. But he also spoke about the fact that there was this team of actors always around Biden who were trying to prevent the meeting with him and Mike Johnson. He mentioned Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and others. And he says it was his opinion that they were making decisions for Biden that Biden didn't even know about.
Can you tell us a story when you say personal observation? What kind
well,
of thing did you see?
It's public now because the Wall Street Journal got it and put it on the front page. But January a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I had been asked. I became speaker in October 2023, and there were all sorts of big national security concerns and everything going on. And I started requesting a meeting with the president because I'm kind of old school. I'm a constitutional law guy. The Speaker of the House should be able to talk to the president, especially in times of great national interest and calamity. But they wouldn't let me meet with him, and his staff kept giving excuses. This went on for like 8 or 9 weeks. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, he doesn't have time. What are you talking about? I'm second in line of the presidency. He has time. I need to talk to him. We had, I can't say the classified parts, but we had some big national concerns at the time that I was losing sleep over. Finally, I just went to the Hill Press Corps and I said, the president is not being allowed to meet with the speaker. There's a problem. So they started putting pressure on him. Long story short, they finally relented. They invited me to the White House. I show up and I realize it's actually an ambush because it's not just me and the president. It's also Kamala Harris, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem, the CIA director, everybody. And then, so I walked in the Oval and, I know what this is. They're going to hotbox the speaker on Ukraine funding. That's what it was. This is probably third week of January. we sit down, we're in the midst of it, and the whole conversation, and I'm going, we don't need to have this conversation. The president reaches over just like this. We're sitting right next to the fireplace in the Oval, and he grabs my arm and he says, the speaker and I just need a couple minutes together. Would y'all just leave us alone? And I looked up on the faces of some of the staff standing around the wall, and they're like, oh, no, he did it. So he called it. He's the commander-in-chief. So everybody leaves, and he and I are standing awkwardly in the middle of the Oval Office right over the rug by that coffee table. And I said, Mr. President, thanks for the moments. This is very important. I got some big national security things I need to talk to you about that I've heard, and I think you know, and what do we do? But first, real quickly, Mr. President, can I ask you a question? I cannot answer this from my constituents in Louisiana. Sir, why did you pause LNG exports to Europe? Like, I don't understand, liquefied natural gas is in great demand by our allies. Why would you do that? Because you understand, we just talked about Ukraine. You understand you're fueling Vladimir Putin's war machine because they got to get their gas from him, And he looks at me stunned with this, and he said, I didn't do that. And I said, Mr. President, yes, you did. It was an executive order, 3 weeks ago. And he goes, no, I didn't do that. And he's arguing with me. I said, Mr. President, respectfully, could I go out here and ask your secretary to print it out? We'll read it together. You definitely did that. And he goes, oh, you talk about natural gas. Yes, sir. He said, no, you misunderstand. He said, what I did is I signed this thing we're gonna conduct a study on the effects of LNG. I said, no, you're not, sir. You paused it. I know. I have the export terminals in my state. I talked to those people this morning. This is doing massive damage to our economy, national security. It occurred to me, Barry, he was not lying to me. He genuinely did not know what he had signed.
So if that is true, and I think it is, that is why I think we have seen a lot of contradictions from the US administration in 2024 especially, or throughout this war. Biden said no Abrams will be sent, no F-16s will be sent, no strikes will be allowed in Russian territory. All of these statements he has walked back on. And my theory is that it's not Biden, but it's the deep state overriding it. Anyhow, at the end of 2024, that is when Ukraine got the ATACMS and they were starting strikes into Russia. Of course, those strikes were to be limited to military infrastructure, and then Ukraine started striking oil refineries. And Putin, of course, warned them that that was a red line, and despite our Western media tries to claim that Putin is soft and he bluffs, Putin doesn't bluff. Putin told them, if you continue to do this, we will go and arm your enemies.
Мы думаем на тему о том, что если кто-то считает возможным.
And so said, so done. President Putin made trips to China, I believe Vietnam, North Korea, Iran, and then to Cuba. And I'm going to come back to that. And each of those trips, he made military pacts with them. And there was an exchange of weapons and technology. The details of which, I don't know everything that was exchanged, but I know that Iran has hypersonic missiles, and I suspect most of those other allies do as well. But the one that was shrouded in the most secrecy, and when I say secrecy, I mean there's very little reporting about it, is the trip to Cuba. And this is where I start to speculate, because I haven't seen any evidence of this. But President Putin sails to Cuba on a nuclear submarine. And this was glossed over in the West. They just said, oh, it's a nuclear submarine, but there are no active warheads on it. That is besides the point. This is a major slap in the face for America. This harkens back to memories of the nuclear threat of the Soviet Union and the Bay of Pigs invasion, I believe under John F. Kennedy, because the Soviet Union was threatening to put Cuba on nuclear weapons. This was Putin sailing into America's backyard to arm one of America's long-standing enemies. Now, we don't know what happened, but this was coming on the heels of Putin making a threat, acting on the threat by arming America's enemies. Sails to Cuba, and you're telling me he left nothing there? I mean, I find that hard to believe. I think most likely he gave them some technology or signed a military deal or put some hypersonic missiles there. I don't know. But that was just not for sure. Now, I'm straying a bit from my original point, because I know I was talking about how large-scale offenses are not possible unless there's deception in warfare. But I'm going off tangent. But one of the theories I've always had was that if Kamala was elected, I think there would be two outcomes. Either we would have been in World War III, or we would have seen a massive strike on the United States from Russian allies. Hear me out. How many of you have seen that video clip of Putin doing an interview? And he was talking about growing up on the streets of Leningrad. And he said, in various words, I may not quote it directly, but one thing he learned growing up in Leningrad is that if you know there's going to be a fight, make sure you hit first.
Еще 50 лет назад Ленинградская улица меня научила одному правилу. Если драка неизбежна, бить надо первым.
That translated means that's a preemptive strike. That's what he did in Ukraine. Ukraine was a preemptive strike. He saw that Zelensky brought about 125,000 of these NATO-trained Ukrainian troops on the borders of Luhansk and Donetsk, getting ready to invade. And he's no dummy. He's not going to sit around and wait for them to invade and wipe out the Donbass militia. He did the invasion preemptively. In fact, the invasion was pursuant to Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which is under self-defense, but it has been interpreted by the courts to be preemptive self-defense, which means you're allowed to strike preemptively to avoid a major attack. And the thinking behind it is that you can't wait until the enemy attacks, because in this day and age, one attack could be so devastating that you don't have the capacity to defend yourself. But there are all sorts of constraints about a preemptive strike. And I did a video about that again years ago. I'm not going to go into it now. But what I'm saying is, President Putin, based on what he said growing up in Leningrad, and based how he has acted in Ukraine, he is not going to wait for Kamala president, who has categorically said, now she doesn't say much. I mean, everything else she says is more or less a word salad, except I remember she said when she was asked on that morning show, The View, if she would do anything different from Biden, and she said that she would not.
Well, if anything, would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
Which means there was going to be more of the same, more escalation from Ukraine and NATO. Putin is not going to wait for Ukraine to start striking civilian homes with missiles or take any other escalatory step from NATO. He, I think, was getting ready to do a preemptive strike if necessary. Now, it may not have been against America, it may have been against certain NATO bases in Europe. But how would that have been done, in my opinion, is not through an invasion or all that nonsense we hear in the West about Russia's coming for Europe next to reinstate the Soviet Union. It would have been, in my opinion, through a pure hypersonic missile attack. And that is why the Oreshnik missile was so important and was what I consider to be the second game changer of this war, second to drones. The Oreshnik missile showed the West that Putin, with one missile, can destroy an entire military base with hypersonic speed. And therefore, all those Baltic nations, those tiny Baltic nations, who are like a lot of bravado and posturing, now are cowering with their tail between the legs, because if a Oreshnik is launched from eastern Russia, whatever is the target, whatever military base is the target, whether it be in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they will have somewhere between 15 to 30 minutes to evacuate before it is wiped out. That is the signal the Oreshnik gives. And the Oreshnik, I believe, puts most of Western Europe in range. Now, if that technology is put on a long-range intercontinental missile and puts America in range, just remember, none of the air defenses that America has can shoot down the Oreshnik. And if he gives that technology to his allies, as he said he would, and Iran has that technology, and Cuba has that technology, you see where I'm going. A coordinated strike over the northern border of America through Canada. Go and watch a video that Indian General Bakshi did on why Greenland is so important for Trump.
Does he want Greenland? You see, the American early warning system, the NORAD, for early warning of Russian ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, Chinese ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads that will fly over the pole shortest distance to America, is based on the front line of Canada and Alaska. Now, that entire missile threat has undergone a paradigm shift. Today you have hypersonic ballistic missiles, hypersonic intermediate range missiles like the Oreshniks. You have the Chinese ballistic missiles, the Chinese hypersonic missiles, all enhancing the threat to the United States of America. The present early warning system of the radars, the gridded radars of the NORAD, is not sufficient to deter this threat. Therefore, Trump wants to take over Greenland, which is also on the way to the Arctic and also provides an avenue for early warning of any missile attack. Trump wants to create an iron dome, infallible iron dome system for the United States, whatever be the cost. He wants to create a new Star Wars complex that will insulate America from the threat of these intercontinental ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles that the Russians and the Chinese today have in plenty. So therefore the threat to the United States, continental United States, has gone up by many orders of magnitude. Most of these hypersonic missiles today are absolutely unstoppable.
One of the reasons is there probably others, is for defense purposes. Because on the northern border of Canada, there is a radar system that America put there since World War II to warn them of any aerial incoming strikes. That's World War II. So that system is woefully outdated and cannot pick up hypersonic missiles. So General Bakshi's theory is that Trump wants Greenland so that he can put a more advanced radar system on Greenland to give America more advanced notice of any hypersonic missile strike. Until that happens, if a coordinated strike were to be launched from Iran or Cuba or Russia over the northern border through Canada, targeting, let's say, American military bases, they will be defenseless. That could be a decapitating strike. Now, of course, I don't know if Russia has the coordinates of all of America's bases to do that, but let's just say it's quite possible, and it's certainly a weak spot for America. Whether or not that's true, that's my speculation. I do think, watching how Putin was moving, that he was, or likely had in mind, he would be willing to do a preemptive strike if Kamala was elected and they continue to escalate. And if it were to happen like how I think it would happen, the most sensible way, a decapitation strike, eliminate all America's major military bases and command structures, America will literally have two options: nuclear war or capitulation. Because the idea of America sending troops to battle Russia is a fool's errand. America is not a land power. America's military power is the Navy and the Air Force, both of which, in the age of hypersonic missiles and Russia's robust air defense system, would make no headway. If America brings any of those aircraft carriers anywhere near the Black Sea, they will be sunk by hypersonic missiles before they can land any troops, before any planes can take off. And I don't think America has a capacity, even if they were launched to a launch attack from Europe. I mean, the cost of such an attack on Russia, the required logistics, it would be a nightmare. It would be damn near impossible. If they can't do it through Ukraine, then it simply can't be done. That's how I see it. It would be a massive failure. And I went off track here. But those are my thoughts I had recently. I have a lot more thoughts kind of brewing about this war. Some of them I've forgotten already. But we're now at the 44-minute mark. I'm going to edit this, and maybe I'll do a part 2 at some point.